Very pleased to welcome you all to the first webinar of a webinar series organized by the CAAFAG Task Force that is focusing on community prevention, release, and reintegration. So there will be two more webinars coming. One will be focusing on children associated with armed forces, with armed groups designated as terrorists. And there will be another one focusing on the prevention of recruitment. And before we start, I would like to highlight to our participants that we have interpretation available in French, Spanish, and Arabic. So you can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can select the relevant language. So for all the English speakers, I invite you to select the English channel, as we'll have one presentation in French, so we want to make sure you're not missing on any presenters. So don't hesitate to ask any questions throughout this webinar. For this, you can use the Q&A button that is at the bottom of your screen. And we invite you to ask all of your questions through the Q&A rather than using the chat. Feel free to use the chat for any other issues, if you have problems hearing or if you have any questions for us. All right, so now I will hand over to Giovanna, who is the co-lead of the CAAFAG Task Force.
Thank you, Sandra, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. My name is Giovanna Via. I'm a long-term consultant with on CAAFAG with UNICEF, and I'm also the co-lead of the CAAFAG Task Force with Sandra. So before we start, we just wanted to give you a quick introduction. The webinar today focuses on different approaches to engaging communities and community-based mechanisms and groups in the planning and implementation of interventions aimed at preventing and recruiting, preventing the recruitment and use of children by armed actors, at facilitating the identification and release of children associated with such groups, and also at ensuring the children who are released receive the appropriate and preferably community-based reintegration support they need to move back to life in their families and communities. So before we listen to our speakers, we would like to remind you all that the CAAFAG toolkit that was developed by the CAAFAG Task Force and released earlier this year provides practitioners with guidance on how to design programs related to the prevention of recruitment of children, the facilitation of release, and the promotion of reintegration. So the tools included in the toolkit are useful to inform practitioners on how to address the risk factors, how to strengthen the protective factors through different stages of programming for CAAFAG, and also include useful step-by-step tips on how to ensure that communities are involved in each of these stages. So having said this, I hand over to Sandra to introduce our speakers today. Really looking forward to listening to the presentations and as well as reading your questions. Thank you. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you, Giovanna. So today we have three panelists for this webinar. First, we will hear from Kelei, who is the country representative of the Dallaire Institute in South Sudan. He will talk about their project of community prevention. Then we will hear from Therese Mansan. She's the Child Protection and Emergency Specialist at UNICEF in Niger. And she will share her experience of community release from Central African Republic. And then we will hear from Sophie Bray-Watkins. She's the Youth Advocacy and Participation Advisor at WatchEye UK. And she will tell us about a community reintegration project that they are implementing in the DRC. So without further ado, I will invite Kelei to talk about community prevention. Con, over to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. And it is a pleasure to be with you on this webinar. I will speak to one aspect on how we are engaging the communities in our program. And as you could see, that one is to be in the hand of a project that was entitled as Building Bridges for Prevention, Women and Security Actors. That's where I will concentrate much. Then I will be talking at least on my screen here on what I see, while the others will have a chance to have a look at it later on. We do one of the integrated point or strategic outcome of our strategic plan is integrating the children and community. And in doing that, we bring it in a form of a communal bringing together. What do we do to that effect? We brought the women organizations and the government institutional bodies that are responsible for child right implementation of child protection. We bring them together, and the police in this sense. So it is the police, the army, the DDR, and the women organizations, and then the UN, e.g. UNICEF, and also the yes, very good. You can go to I'm now on the slide 3, please, the third. Because the mission, our mission and vision, you will get it later on our website, not to kill the time. Yes, as you could see now, those pictures that you are now seeing are imaging how do we bring the people together in form of roundtable or in the community dialogue. In a community dialogue, we sit together and we discuss the matters that each and everybody can actually grab. And in doing so, you make sure that each and every one of us do know what is his or her role in a community. Please push forward. Next. Yes. That is, I think you went far. Should be slide 4. Yes. Slide 4. Yes, that is slide 4 indeed. On this slide, we had a chance with the government of Canada that was funding this innovation and transformation. We call it FIT. What we were looking at was indeed to bring the women together with the security sector. In South Sudan, there was a big gap, and the gap was the community organizations, and specifically the women whom we think they are the custodian of children at the early age that they are being recruited, were very much afraid of going to the army or to the police and then talk about the concern of child rights. Simply because areas of the armed organizations do not want civilians that are unintroduced just to enter into it. So that prevented them. There was also another issue. Police and the army are difficulties also in approaching the communities. So we bring these two groups together to work. And one of the things that it went very well is the community dialogue. In a community dialogue, police, women, youth, chief, elderly people came together and they talk about how best they should protect themselves. One of the good examples was that recruitment of the children is not purely when children are now with the armed forces of guerrilla that are fighting the government. Even the gangs, because police sometimes will use some boys that shows as soldiers and as police, and those are negative, have a negative shows to the society. Also, police sometimes post in the community as a threat, because whoever is found the police and it is beaten, it will make the other children to shy away from running to the police. So those issues are discussed at the level of the community dialogue, and they will reach to the conclusion of that. You, the chief, when you see something is bad, please call the police while you handle it this way and that way. And they also inform the police that when we see the children, you also need to make sure that you handle them the way that will not put us in difficulties with them again. Simply don't go and beat the children, don't jail them, don't be too harsh. When you do it like that, children will run away. We ourselves will also keep our children at our houses. And in so doing, you don't report. And if you don't report, violence will go big. And those were also including the conflict-related sexual violence being addressed in those communities' dialogue. Next slide, please. Now, on the impact, when we bring the women together, first, we put a group of women that were all trained, and they were from a civil society, 45 of them, and we let them meet themselves alone to identify the issues of concern. And once they identify the issues of concern, they themselves will be the one now to point out exactly which areas that we need to go and tackle. For example, if they think that it is the police that need to understand more about the CAAFAG, then we tackle the police department that is responsible for those. And we conduct the training on such issues. If they identify the army, and specifically the department and the issue of the recruitment of the children in the army in a certain garrison, then we now pack together and conduct a training to the army on the child rights and on the recruitment, and especially the act in South Sudan that prohibited recruitment of young children. And in so doing, we will also bring them together. And one of the very good things that they agreed upon was to conduct a round table. One was the community dialogue, as I already talked about it. The round table brought all these policymakers, and we sat together. We discussed what are the needs. Why do the DDR work alone and the society is not aware of them? Why do the army is trying to protect the children without the knowledge of the society? Why is the police is also working within the police and there is no link? This issue bring everybody together, and they will be starting finger pointing to each other first, and then later on come to a conclusion that, oh, we need each other. And a good example was, if a child is demobilized, for example, the child have to go to DDR. DDR have to hand this child over to the NGO concerned for reintegration. That NGO have now to work in close relation with the society. Working in a close society, in relation with society, the society will be watching out. If that child is about to retrieve back, they have to bring it out to the knowledge of the police. On the issues of the CRSV, if something has happened, they have to report it to the police. Police have also to check with the societies, the communities concerned, and that working in relation, bring them together. Police sometimes would have to admit, they will say, when we captured the children, we don't know where to go to. Say, come to our civil society organization, we will correctly identify to you which organization you will go to. Another important point that we get from those 45 women was also the fact that they needed to have a consultation meeting with policymakers And the Dallaire Institute made that possible to bring the ministries of justice, child and social welfare, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defense, and they sit together with the women and discuss the matters of concern. And in those discussions, always has come out that indeed we need a woman. And the police one time said, one of the police generals said one time, we have been repeating it on the TV and in every public awareness that security is not a responsibility of the police, but it is a responsibility of all. So this is how we do it and how the women have helped us. Can we please move to the next slide? Now the future work. What we also did in those, this one I leave it an open space, but I have to talk to some technical issues that we do. We try to engage through the community dialogue, the young age, to show them the map. What you can see in their hand holding there is the map. We do a village maps. And in village maps, we have identified hotspots where normally when children are found to be there, they are easily to be recruited by the army. So we would identify those areas, and then we tell them that this is where children can easily get into recruitment. They will look at those, and this is where now the communication will start between themselves. And those communication generate how the children themselves, the young actors, become the protectors of their own young siblings and themselves. They identify those areas and they are told on how to avoid such areas and which areas they are supposed, according to the map, they're supposed to be playing around so that they don't fall into the hand of the recruiters. And our future work is that to continue working with the women and the youth, and possibly also bring in the media to have these three groups and then combine them with the authorities. Like I said before, the main focusing institution for us, for the authorities, the Ministry of Child and Social Welfare, is the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defense, and Justice. The other government institution will bring them along on this. In the interior, this is where we have to cover the police and the correctional officers, the correctional department. Also in the defense, that's where we have the army. And this is our intention to continue working with these people in that life, involving the youth, the women, and the elderly in the community, plus the policymakers, and they implemented the security actors.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Con.
And last question.
I can see there are some questions coming already for you. We will take questions after all the presentations. But thank you very much. I think that was a very interesting example of how you engage women from the community and into this prevention work. So excellent experience. So now I will invite Therese Mansan from UNICEF to share our experience on community release from Central African Republic. Over to you, Therese.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tous.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon to each and all of you. It's a pleasure for me to be hearing these experiences that you've been having, and also to answer these calls for the protection of children and for the freedom of children. So we started with the observation that everything that is remaining after a child returns, such as the reintegration. So that is what I'll be speaking about. In the context in which most of the armed groups and subgroups had a very community approach, and there was an interaction with the community before going into the military operations. We needed to take into account that the community is a key actor, even in a conflict zone. All children need to be freed, regardless of the duration of the conflict. So to free them, we need to identify every actor who could have a key role and that could have an impact, and who could also have a positive outcome for the result after the liberation. We also observed that there were certain difficulties to free children, especially for children who were associated with two armed groups, the Sindika and the Antimalika, for several reasons. We had an approach with the community, and we had reasons for identifying why it was so hard to reintegrate these children. These children were sometimes used as sexual slaves, so it wasn't they weren't very well accepted. Other children had committed crimes within these armed groups, so these were seen as sources of trouble, and so it wasn't so easy to get people engaged in the reintegration of these children. And sometimes these armed groups didn't want to have the children leave. So the process that was initiated to free these children was to have discussions with the armed groups who were part of the strategy. We also had a community mobilization, and that will be discussed in the next slide here. So in my presentation, I will speak to you about how we mobilized the community, what were the issues that we encountered, the key results, and the lessons learned. So next slide, please. We can go to slide 4 now, please. Why do we have a community engagement? It's because we have all the different players the the different areas, and we need to be able to speak to the different groups.
S'engager et faire venir les enfants, mais
Sometimes we think it's UNICEF that needs to bring these groups in, but sometimes we find ourselves in situations in which these children are not accepted. So we will comment on that on the next slide. Next slide, please. So we work with the community to develop a community capacity to engage these communities, because we have the expertise and the leadership in the community. They can interact with these armed groups.
leaders religieux qui ont parfois gardé.
Particularly, we have the religious leaders who are in contact with the leaders of armed groups sometimes. We also have youth leaders, and they have sometimes had these young people who were in the armed groups who are now in the community. These are key actors who can lead a dialogue with these armed groups. For example, we had the Antibalaka. They had a self-defense militia within the community. So this was a good opportunity for us to have access to the leaders of the armed groups. We also needed to realize that even if we brought the children out, there are obstacles, because the children don't want to go back to civilian life. They are afraid, they don't know what's waiting for them. So the fact that they have members of the community who are engaged and who go and speak with these children, with the leaders of the armed groups, to be able to comfort these children. and to know that the understanding is there and that they're going to be brought back to a welcoming community.
Dans les recherches, actions qu'on a menées, que certains
As well, in our actions, we realized that certain communities did not accept these children because they thought that these children perhaps committed actions that dishonored the community, that were unforgivable. So in these cases, we needed to take the concerns of these communities into account and to do the efforts so that these children could return to their communities. So as UNICEF or as NGOs, we saw that there could be certain risks and certain difficulties. The other point that we notice is that at times the leaders of the armed groups wanted to make sure that the communities are ready to receive the children who had been with them for a long time. So the fact of knowing that the community and the community leaders are committed through this community capacity to receive these children back. Next slide. So this work was not, thank you. This work wasn't easy, but we can say that we succeeded, for example, in the Kaga-Bandoro region from 2014 until 2016, we were not able to get any children released. But after the strategy, we were able to free the first wave of children that left the Anti-Balaka. They came from Seleka. This was a group that was set up, but they had ramifications within the community. And they also had connections with the religious leaders. And for the first time, we were able to get a group of children with 45% of them being girls. And there were some children who had been child brides, and they weren't sure that they would be brought back into the community, but they did go through reintegration programs into the community. So more and more children were released and were accepted back into the community through the reintegration. Next slide, please. We also need to say that this work has certainly faced certain challenges in the community because there were risks on the community level to have discussions with these armed groups.
les Sénéca en Centrafrique, mais il le fallait. Donc,
And as well, there was problems of trafficking, and so these discussions need to happen. So there were times at which the armed groups, particularly certain leaders, did not appreciate the fact that some leaders were committed in freeing the children. There were also some defense and armed forces did not appreciate the dialogues with the armed groups that were considered to be enemies, and they were fighting against them. But another challenge at the community level was the reluctance for the community to be engaged in this process, to go and free the children, especially children who were suspected of crimes. They were also worried about impacts from this. And certain leaders, even in 2021, held on to these child soldiers because they were among the core group. And so it was very problematic for UNICEF and for other actors because they were afraid that they would be poorly viewed by these armed groups. There was also fear that this mission would not succeed in the eyes of the community when there would be an engagement with certain leaders to be with us in the discussions and to have the discussions with the anti-Balaka. Sometimes the families came and but sometimes the community would not be willing to step forward, and other groups would. So what are the lessons that we learned from this experience? This is the last slide. Next slide, please. First of all, we can improve this process for the release of children by having a community engagement. The community must be in agreement and they must provide that commitment. It is possible to, little by little, reverse the negative perception of children who have voluntarily enlisted. These children might have committed crimes. They might have pillaged different towns, and maybe they are not well viewed within their communities. There are many children in that situation, but with our community approach, we're able to go into these communities, especially for the girls who were sexual slaves. We are able to have the parents reopen their homes and to accept them back into civilian life. Even though some of these girls stayed, this shows what the difficulty is for all these children. Another lesson that we learned is that the entire process of children reintegration is a long process, and it requires a community engagement and their involvement from the very beginning. So the fact that they are engaged from the very beginning, since the demobilization, this enables a better understanding of the risks of the children in going back to the community, and also enables us to identify actions to mitigate these risks and to apply community solutions in order to prepare the solution for the reintegration programs.
Let's
Thank you
take
very
children
much,
back home. Merci
Therese.
beaucoup.
And that's a very nice transition actually to the next presentation. So thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting experience from Central African Republic and how you engage religious leaders and various community leaders to negotiate the release of children. I see also some questions, so I think we have time to dig a bit more during the Q&A session. So now I will invite Sophie Bray-Watkins to talk about their experience in community reintegration. Sophie, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Real pleasure to be here today. Many thanks for joining. So I'm going to walk you through a quick overview of a quick methodology that we developed at War Child, which is a youth-led advocacy, and then move on to a specific project in the CCDRC, which was engaging young people and then working with them in the community to look at recruitment and use. So if we come to the next slide. Okay, so the program that we've developed is called Voice More. So if you come on to the next slide. And Voice More is our youth advocates development program where young people select an issue that particularly concerns them. And then they design and run their own advocacy projects in the community. And what we do is support that work, but we also look at ways to elevate those concerns at the national and international level. So if we come to the next slide. And the ethos and values of the programme, it's worth mentioning. So what we're trying to do here when we started developing this was thinking much more about authentic voice in our advocacy work, more equitable, empowered ways of running programming, and a way to gather and understand different perspectives in our work. We see it as the kind of necessary change to humanitarian and emergency approaches, so not just towards advocacy. Through this work, you can find out all manner of information that's really helpful in informing and designing programmatic work and not just advocacy work. So next slide, please. Okay, the programme consists of a number of different stages. So we kick off with a spokesperson training, where the young people develop their skills and confidence to act as spokespersons within a community. Then advocacy training, where young people learn about the principles of advocacy and how to, what to think about when they're going to be designing and running an advocacy project. We then move on to, this is one of the newer phases, research training. What we found in the early pilots was that young people really wanted to have their own evidence base from which to use for their advocacy, and also because a lot of the issues that they select is really not very much known at the local level or on those particular issues. So they are supported through a research training to understand basic principles and practices and analysis, and then they design and conduct their own research. This is then followed by them devising their own plan for advocacy. And as I said, we would then also look at what ways we could help support from our various different offices to link their work to wider work that might be going on in the sector to do with that issue or in that particular country. So next slide. Okay, so the DRC project started in 2020 and it's just finished, but will be due an extension soon as well, which we'll talk about later. It's in the Masisi region of DRC, a very remote. So we've got young people joining from different villages that are, it's quite difficult to get them together. So it's a very kind of rural, remote area. 20 young people in the group who were 17 to 23 at the start of the programme, with an equal gender split. And this particular voice small group was part of a wider project, which was Aid Connect funded. It was called the Partnership Against Child Exploitation, or PACE, and there is a website for that if you want to check out the other activity that was going on within that consortium. And just a quick note on support. So it's integrated to a wider project, but we have one specific assistant who'd support for the whole 2 years. So next slide. So the young people, when they were asked to think about what was going on, they really felt there was all sorts of different issues that they could have really selected from in the area. But their particular concern was about recruitment. And that was because of all the different negative coping mechanisms that they said young people adopted. And that could be anything from drug use, alcohol use, but also what they would describe as a kind of socialization of living in the bush, or the bad life of the bush, as they termed it, and how difficult that made it to be able to interact or reintegrate back into regular society afterwards. And then they also talked a lot about the stigma that young people face. We've heard a little bit about that in the other presentations, but how difficult it is for them to then make that breakaway, and especially girls who were particularly rejected by community, as we know. And then the wider impact. So they felt that it was creating a cycle, a kind of very vicious circle effect, where it was creating more violence and poverty, fear within the community, which was then reducing life chances for young people who in turn then join groups. So them seeing it very much as a kind of a vicious circle of issues that were all compounding each other. Next slide. So the young people decided to undertake their own research. As I mentioned before, they first did a 3-day training, participatory training, which is understanding research, covering things, skills building, risk assessments. There's lots of risk assessment involved in this because of the topic being so sensitive, but also to do with the way in which they needed to move around and operate during the research gathering, the data gathering, and analysis as well, and different analysis techniques. In total, the young people worked with 278 respondents in the community, and that was via 24 focus group discussions and 28 key informant interviews. So they generally did focus groups with children and youth separately, some whom were ex-CAAFAG, and also with parents of children who might have joined, or of children and youth in the area. They also spoke to community leaders, some local authority representatives, civil society representatives, and a few security personnel. For those, it was generally more interviews that they conducted. For the analysis, we did a participatory joint analysis process. So we're using a kind of grounded theory, which is basically looking for repetition and patterns and different kind of looking at for keywords and then finding them within all the different recordings and the transcripts that we got back from those different activities. Something that's worth saying is, while there were ex-CAAFAG that took part in this research, the numbers were very low. So we primarily would see this as a research piece, which is giving us some information and insights into just general community sentiments and ideas in relation to recruitment and preventing recruitment, which is still obviously incredibly valuable if you're looking to develop a response in that particular setting. So next slide. So what we found was contributing factors towards recruitment. So what was spoken about a lot in the community was the lack, primarily, like by far the biggest and most popular answer was the lack of job and livelihood opportunities, and all respondents focusing in on that is what was driving recruitment. And being in an attempt to meet basic needs, could be food, resources. So yeah, that being the main factor. Lack of educational opportunity was also cited as important and seen as something that was particularly lacking, but also access to land, and what's termed locally as kind of land grabbing. So inability to cultivate your own land and therefore produce your own food, and that having a knock-on effect. So these were the real strong contributing factors. Something notable that wasn't mentioned or given very minimally or not at all as a reason for joining in this particular context was any mention of revenge. So doing it despite the land grabbing, revenge not really being a major reason, nor ideology, religion, or any kind of other reasons to want to fight, so or to join a group. Pre-existing activity in the area. So the group also decided that they wanted to ask local people what they felt was already going on or had been done to address this issue. Primarily, it was sensitization, cited as sensitization and awareness raising, with INGOs really seen as the main responsible for a solution. So that probably reflecting a certain dependency that exists in the area already on aid and different organisations that might be able to deliver that aid. Other notable findings were that young people there was not really any mention of forced recruitment. There is coercion, but generally it was seen that young people were actually exercising some agency and deciding to join because they didn't have very many options at all, and that included children. Recreational activities and MHPSS was marginally mentioned as something that might be relevant or could be a solution, but it was much, as you'll see in the research in the recommendations section, which is next, it wasn't really given as kind of a really important area. So there wasn't much talk around the psychological impacts or anything else. It was much more focused on the kind of practical meeting basic needs. Rights framework. So this was interesting, is that there was quite a lot of knowledge around the convention or certain understanding of child rights, but there was a lot of flagging of lack of accountability. So that probably comes through the fact that there is efforts to sensitize or awareness raise about the issue, but actually not very much being done outside of that to address the kind of other factors that are causing this problem. And gender. So gender, despite the fact that girls were flagged as being more likely to suffer significant stigma, girls were really ignored. And that was also a weakness of the research itself, was that the young people themselves didn't really kind of appreciate that gender lens through their research questions that they chose and the way in which they looked at the analysis. this was something discussed in a specific session during the final analysis stage, and they really took on board that even they had kind of spoken in a masculine pronoun and ignored maybe the girls' experiences quite a lot during the whole process. And that's why in the recommendations, they then chose to actually include one later on. So if we come to the next slide. So the recommendations that young people have, these are very short. You can read more. The full report, there is a full report in English and in French on our website, and I believe that this link will be shared in the chat. It'd be helpful if it could be shared just now. And there's also a summary in English, and you can read the full recommendations, because this is very, very brief, to understand a bit more about what they were thinking about. The top line was that there needed to be more emphasis on vocational training and livelihoods, and without that they didn't really feel that the community wasn't feeling like there was going to be much change. As mentioned in the last slide, awareness raising and sensitization, less talk, probably more action, and thinking about who is responsible, so the duty holders, accountability. And then access to land as being something that's not an easy thing to address, but also probably quite absent in a lot of programming. So thinking about ways in which that might be possible to think about land access for people. The specific ideas that they had for how to improve reintegration programming that they felt would be the development of something like a provision of a community-based transit and orientation centre, as they called it. So that being a one-stop shop where young people who've had association with an armed group could go and receive a really holistic package of support. So once they've been demobilised and have been referred, that they would have help finding somewhere to live that's suitable, to reconnect with their family if that was deemed possible and given as a priority for them, but also things like support in getting back into education for younger children, support with livelihoods programming, income generating activity, some PSS activities, and just social workers, opportunities to really connect with the local community, and for these centres to be in the community, very much kind of integrated to the community life, and even community run. So this is something that the young people really felt that it was like it needed to be a much more holistic package of support for young people. They felt that there was more that should be done to encourage acceptance for local leaders. There was mention of religious leaders just now. This was also something that they felt was missing in current programming, so that organisations or those that are trying to support such work should really think about that community acceptance at leader level, and to try and get that buy-in, because that can make a real key difference to how the programmes, how successful the programmes are. As mentioned, more support for females, for girls, and upholding child protection law. The young people, good laws at international level. There are lots of strategies and laws at national level, but the problem is it's just that they're not understood properly, and or they're just not upheld. So much more efforts in thinking about what organisations doing reintegration programming could do to support that activity at that level. Livelihood support, as mentioned, education, and note on that again is that there needs to be more flexible education opportunities. So older children and youth, it would still be beneficial for them to receive some education, but this needs to be part-time, flexible, to fit in with their care responsibilities or their work responsibilities. And provisional activities to let the community and the young people decide what they might be, and to decide what their version of the PSS provision that would be good for them to be able to say so. So next slide.
Yeah, sorry, Sophie, we're coming to the end now. We're a bit short on time.
Sure, I'm going to do the last slide. Is that okay? Very quickly. I think others might have run over a little bit. So if I could, I'm trying to go very quickly. So a note on the advocacy action is that they've met with as you can see there, local meetings with leaders, civil society. The security mission would be a good one. But we also I've supported them to do some international advocacy. If you want to listen to the podcasts, they're available on the same link that was just shared, I believe, in the chat. And another note is if you want a Swahili copy of the report and the research, it's not on the website, but it is available. So just to send a note. And the last point on this is that we've actually secured funding to continue to work. The biggest challenge has been the slow pace that you need to work at in the local context, and also the short-term funding that we had. But we've now just received money so that the young people can continue the work, and their aim is to set up their own community advocacy movement, and that's what they're keen to do. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Sophie, for your experience from the DRC. Very interesting, and so there are some links in the chat where you can find more. There is a whole report about this project. Very interesting. So we have now a few minutes left for the Q&A. So Giovanna, is there one question that you think we should focus on?
Yeah, so there are quite a few questions pending, but Therese and Con have done a great job, and I can see that Therese is still typing away. But I think the one from Soma was great. Maybe you can read it because it's in French.
Yes,
you'll have a better accent than mine.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. I'll say it in English then. So can we say that children who have been released from armed groups are completely reintegrated in the communities? And what are the activities that they implement? And is this enough so that they are now encouraged to go back to armed groups? So basically to prevent re-recruitment. So who can answer that question?
I think it was addressed at Therese.
At
Yes.
Therese,
Bien,
okay.
je pense.
Mhm.
Oui, en
Okay.
fait, j'étais en train de rédiger les réponses.
Yes, I was actually writing an answer, but I can definitely answer orally. So this question is yes, but because children, the release of children is always conditioned to the implementation of a reintegration program. So most of the children who came out of armed groups were reintegrated into the community. But we need to note that when we speak about reintegration, we should note that this is a whole process with several benchmarks. We know that they're out of in the community, that they have access to reintegration programs, especially job training. But in terms of a report, looking at protection elements and reading on the internet, you can see that we have got a lot of children out of the trafficking circles. Most of them are back in the community, are back at school, they're learning a trade. For example, we were able to train children for a significant, for the sanitary and water professions. These children have become water and sanitary professions. They are hired by people who go from village to village, and they have a mission that they can work towards. So we've saved many children, not all of them. What's the percentage? Maybe 3 to 5% were not able to be successfully reintegrated. And that's due partially to the context of instability, but most of the children had a positive outcome, despite the many challenges.
Thank you, Therese.
So there was another question that was from Paula Stengo. It says it's been answered live, but I don't believe it has. So I'll just read it. And if Paula, if you think it's been answered, please write in the chat. Apologies, everyone, for the call. So the question says, what are the best practices and key steps to initiate discussions to release children when, for example, the non-state armed actor is not acknowledged? So I think this question could be for Con or for Therese. So I don't know if Con, if you want to take it, or if Therese, we'll go back to you again.
Bien, il y avait une question avant ça, mais je vais répondre à
There was
ça.
a question before that, but I'll answer your question. So is the question in the chat? Sorry, where was I finding this question?
Yes. So the question is, what are the best practices and key steps to initiate discussions to release children, particularly when the armed state group is not acknowledged?
Ah oui. Ok, très bien.
All right, very good. I understand. So the protection of children in armed conflicts, there's several types of armed groups, those are which are recognized or non-recognized. So once these groups commit these violations or recruit children, we need to be able to identify strategies in order to approach them. One of the groups consider there's groups that are like militias or self-defense groups, and they have spokespersons, leaders. What I can say about our experience there in South Sudan, before we have a dialogue with these armed groups, we need to know if these groups, whether or not they're recognized, whether they have a political or armed branch, and to know how we start a dialogue. We need to find allies. We need to find allies within these armed groups with whom we can have a discussion so that these children can be demilitarized. So as you know, there are strategies with the government, but there's also strategies with the community. We need to know who we can turn to as allies within these military groups to have a dialogue in order to be able to release, have
Thank you,
the
Therese.
children
I'm
released.
sorry, we're at the end of our time. I know it's a bit frustrating. There's so many questions. So I encourage all the panelists to respond to the questions directly in the Q&A if you want to take a couple of minutes. And I wanted to thank sincerely all three panelists for sharing their field experience. You know, you're hands-on there, and we can feel like you know what it's like, and you have tested different things. There are some challenges, obviously, but I think you give a lot of hope to all the people who participate to this webinar, that it's possible to prevent recruitment, it's possible to contribute to release and to facilitate reintegration in involving the communities. And I think this is what we wanted to talk about today. And we see that it's not just a kind of a nice to have, it's actually a must. We need to involve the community. We cannot do without. And so there's been some links shared in the chat, some reports, some tools and resources. We also invite you to go to the Alliance website to see the resources that have been developed by the CAAFAG task force. And there you will find a lot of examples of community interventions as well. Before you leave, we wanted just to ask you to fill a quick poll survey just to see what you thought about this webinar, and if there is anything you think we can do differently, or if you were satisfied about this type of webinar. As I said, there are a few more coming by next year. And so yeah, we'd love to hear your feedback on this. So just quickly click on your screen. You should see the poll appearing, and and you can easily respond before you go. So
it's not clicking, Sandra.
Yeah, I think as a panelist, you won't be able to do it, but it's for participants to answer.
Okay.
So yeah, there are 2 questions I see. Yeah. And yeah, and apologies, we were not able to answer all the questions, but I think these are good questions that we will keep and see if we can maybe gather them and see if there is another webinar maybe that could be organized to address some of this pending questions. So thank you everyone. Thank you for your attendance and thank you to the panelists.